The grave was simple. That was the thing that broke Eric every time he came here. No monument. No grand inscription carved by alien craftsmen. Just a smooth stone marker, pale as winter, pressed into the cold earth of New Vethera's northern ridge. He had carved her name himself, with shaking hands and a blade that kept slipping because he could not stop crying long enough to hold it steady. Serafina. Below it, 2 dates. And between them, a life that had contained more courage than he had ever deserved to witness. He knelt. The grass around the marker was different from the grass elsewhere on the ridge. Darker, richer, as though the earth beneath it remembered something warm. Eric had noticed that months ago and had not let himself think about what it meant. Grief had a way of closing doors that logic tried to open. He pressed his palm flat against the stone. "Hey, Sarah," he said. His voice was rough. It was always rough now. "Brought you something." He set a small bundle beside the marker. Dried fire blossoms, the orange and red ones she had loved because she said they smelled like the inside of a forge. She had always said things like that. Strange, beautiful things that reminded him she was not entirely his. That half of her had come from somewhere older and stranger than the world he understood. He had loved that half just as fiercely as the half that used to steal bread from his coat pocket and fall asleep with her head on his shoulder during long shuttle rides. "The council approved the memorial proposal," he said, settling back onto his heels. The wind off the ridge was cold and smelled of iron. "Full honors. They want to put her name on the wall in the Capitol. I told them." He stopped, cleared his throat. "I told them she would have hated that. She would have said something like, 'Father, I am not a wall. I am a sky.'" He smiled. The smile hurt. "They're doing it anyway." 40 meters away, behind a shelf of black rock that jutted from the ridge like a broken tooth, Serafina watched him. She was careful. She had been careful for 7 months now. She knew exactly how far her father's human senses could reach: sound, smell, peripheral motion, and she stayed precisely outside all of them. It was not difficult. Before the change, before the accident that had cracked open whatever dormant thing lived in her blood, she had been merely fast and merely clever. Now she was something else entirely. She pressed her back against the cold rock and folded her wings tight against her spine. They were large enough now that folding them required conscious effort, a slow, deliberate compression that she had spent weeks practicing, so they made no sound. Her scales, copper along her shoulders, deepening to dark bronze at the edges, absorbed the gray light of the afternoon without reflecting it. Another thing she had learned by accident. Another thing she had cataloged in the long, silent months of her not being dead. She watched her father bow his head. Her throat tightened. She did not have a human throat anymore, not precisely, but the sensation was the same. The old architecture of grief, rebuilt in new material. "Go to him," something in her said. It said it every time. She stayed behind the rock. The accident had not been an accident. She had understood that in the first hours of her recovery, lying in the dark of a cave 3 kilometers from New Vethera's eastern perimeter with burns across 60% of her body slowly knitting themselves closed. The Vetherii separatists had known what she was, had known that a human-dragon hybrid working as a scout for the Colonial Defense Commission was a political liability they could not allow to testify before the council. They had not known what she would become when pushed past dying. She had not known either. The wings had come first, then the scales, then the claws, and the restructured vision that let her see heat's signatures through solid stone, and the fire that she had accidentally ignited in her own chest the first time she had tried to speak, and found that her voice had changed into something that shook the walls of the cave around her. By the time she could move, could think clearly, could assess, she had already been mourned. She had stood outside New Vethera in the dark and watched the lights in the city and understood, with a clarity that felt like swallowing cold water, that walking back in was not simple. Not anymore. Not when the separatists were still embedded in the council's outer ring. Not when her own nature, already controversial, already the subject of 3 formal challenges to her commission status, had now shifted so far beyond category that she could not predict how even people who had loved her would react. Not when her father was a retired field medic with a bad heart, and she was not sure she could control the expression on her face well enough to keep the fire out of her eyes when she saw him for the first time. She needed to be careful. She needed to be sure. So she had waited, and watched, and learned herself. and gathered intelligence on the separatist network with the patience of something that no longer feared the dark or the cold or being alone. And every week, without fail, she came to the ridge when her father came to the ridge. I keep thinking, Eric said to the stone, about that morning, when you were maybe 6. You climbed onto the roof of the processing station because you said you could see the mountains better from up there. He exhaled slowly. I was furious. I screamed at you for 20 minutes. Do you remember what you said? The wind moved through the dried fire blossoms. You said, Father, the world is bigger than your worry. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eye. 6 years old. Where did you get that? I was never that brave. Your mother wasn't. She was brave in different ways. But that thing you had, that thing. He shook his head. I don't know where you got it, but I'm glad you had it. I'm glad the world got to see it, even if, his voice fractured. He let it. Even if it cost everything. Behind the rock, Serafina pressed her fist against her sternum. The world is bigger than your worry, she thought. Yes, I remember. She also remembered that she had said it because she had been terrified and had not wanted him to know. She had been up on that roof because a boy in her class had told her she was wrong, that hybrids were not real people, that she was a mistake, that she should not be allowed to stand in line with the other children. She had climbed until she could not hear him anymore, until the mountains were bigger than his voice. Her father had never known that part. She had protected him from it then, the same way she was protecting him now. The same fierce, helpless logic. If he does not know the worst of it, he does not have to carry it. She understood, watching him kneel in the cold, that this was not kindness. It was cowardice dressed in love's clothing. Eric stayed for a long time. When he finally rose, his knees were stiff and the light had shifted to the thin gold of late afternoon. He straightened slowly, touched the top of the stone marker, stood there with his hand resting on it like he was trying to transmit something through rock and earth and whatever distance lay between the living and the dead. I hope it didn't hurt, he said quietly. At the end, I hope there was something good, something warm. He picked up his coat, turned toward the path, stopped. The fire blossoms on the grave were moving. Not in the wind had stilled. They were moving against it, petals lifting toward the ridge, toward the shelf of black rock, as though drawn by heat from a source that should not exist on a cold afternoon on an empty hillside. Eric stared. He was a field medic. He was rational. He had spent 40 years in service to the idea that the universe operated according to rules. But he had also raised a daughter who said the world is bigger than your worry, and he had learned, in his grief, to leave certain doors unlocked. He turned toward the ridge, toward the dark rock, toward the impossible warmth the flowers were reaching for. Sarah, he said. His voice did not shake. It was the steadiest it had been in 7 months. Behind the rock, Serafina closed her eyes, opened them, stepped out. She was enormous and luminous and terrifying, and she was his. And when Eric saw her, he made a sound that was not a word in any language, just a father's recognition, raw and total, the kind that bypasses every category the mind has built. She crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and folded down onto her knees in front of him, wings spreading slightly for balance. And she was still bigger than him, even kneeling, and none of that mattered at all. Hi, Dad, Serafina said. Her voice rang like a bell struck deep in a mountain. He grabbed her face in both hands, pressed his forehead to hers. You, he said. Just that. She put her arms around him very carefully, the way you hold something precious, something you are not sure you have the right to still have. I know, she said. I know. I'm sorry. The fire blossoms on the grave rustled in a wind that had nothing to do with weather. Above the ridge, the sky was enormous. It always had been,